Thank you all for joining us. My name is Liz Watson. I'm the Executive Director of the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, and this is another episode of Dispatch from the Front Lines. This is a weekly series from the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center in which we hear from people whose lives have been upended by this pandemic. We hear from our movement partners, and we hear from congressional champions who are fighting for policy solutions that help our families and communities. So for those of you tuning in for the first time, the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center is a nonprofit organization that works to inform the public about policies that promote justice, equity, and fairness. And tonight's dispatch focuses on how COVID-19 is affecting Native Americans and tribal governments. And while we are all affected by this global pandemic, it's clear that we're not all at equal risk. The coronavirus pandemic is exposing the deadly consequences of decades of disinvestment and discrimination for so many communities, especially for Native Americans. Just by way of example, if the Navajo Nation were a state, they would have the second highest per capita rate of confirmed coronavirus cases, behind only New York. Tribal nations were already experiencing high rates of unemployment, lack of access to broadband, lack of access to clean water, and high quality healthcare before COVID-19. Despite the devastation to tribal nations and urban indigenous communities, the federal policy solutions have not met the scale of the problem. The CARES Act allocated $8 billion for tribal relief efforts, but the distribution of funding was delayed by weeks, when days can make a difference between life and death. And at the same time, many Native American people are turning to traditional culture to confront this pandemic and implementing community-centered solutions that can serve as a model for the nation. We are so honored and lucky to have an amazing array of guests with us tonight. Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico, North Dakota State Representative Ruth Buffalo, Faith Spotted Eagle of the Native Organizers Alliance and the Brave Heart Society, the National Congress of American Indians CEO Kevin Allis, and Tara Houska of the Giniw Collective to talk about how Native Americans and tribal governments are navigating this crisis. So thank you all again for joining us. We're honored to have you here. We know for the guests who've joined us from around the country, what an incredibly difficult and trying time this is. We appreciate the time that you're taking out of your day, your time taking care of your loved ones, to be with us tonight for this important conversation. So first I'm going to introduce Kevin Allis, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Congress of American Indians. Kevin is an enrolled member of the Forest County Potawatomi community and has more than 2 decades of experience as an advocate and as an attorney in Washington, D.C., alongside practicing federal Indian law and serving as a labor and employment litigation attorney. He is a former law enforcement officer who served the Baltimore Police Department for 8 years. So Kevin, state, local, and tribal governments are really bearing the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic, and in many ways, our nation's inadequate response. This has been a huge burden across the board, but we're seeing tribal governments face special challenges in getting the relief they need and in protecting their communities. Can you tell us about what some of those challenges are for tribal governments in addressing this moment and what you would like to see in terms of federal policy moving forward?
Liz, thanks so much for having us. It's an honor to be here with this bench of experts and also your forum. So Indian country is facing a lot of challenges. Tribal governments, first and foremost, a large part of the revenues and resources that fund essential government programs come from tribal businesses. not only casino gaming operations, but all kinds of other businesses in the entertainment and vacation and travel industry. And they're all closed down right now. So you're seeing no revenues coming in. So the funds that Congress has appropriated for tribes is really important. I mean, it's important for the states and local governments, but they have some part of their tax base that's still up and running. What we've seen, and it's across the board, from health, education, nutrition, and our economic sectors, kind of a failure to engage, the federal government's failure to engage in proper tribal consultation. We've seen delays in that as well. We've seen sluggish interdepartmental cooperation. We've seen limited communication with tribal applicants in many of these different programs, creation of non-statutory barriers to accessing funds, for example, in the PPP program. Banks, you had to be a customer of the bank or some kind of thing that made it difficult to quickly get the money. And then a lack of transparency in the creation of methodologies for the distributions of funds to tribal governments, specifically with the government relief fund, how that money is to go out to tribal governments, and what were they looking at when it comes to population, to employment, to expenditures. We really don't know what that is. We've been in the dark. What we've seen so far is that they really haven't listened much to what has gone on and has been voiced by tribal leaders in the consultation. They have not, gone into the things that tribal leaders have thought to be really important. And some of this money just hasn't gone out. Of the $8 billion for tribal governments, only 60% of that has gone out. The other 40%, we don't know exactly when that's going to go out. We're thinking it's going to be the week of June 5th. How it's going to go out, how are they going to weigh that? We have no idea. It's kind of messy right now, and we're really concerned about it because, as you said, minutes and hours matter. Days and weeks are detrimental to the general welfare of tribal communities and the health welfare of the citizens that live in these communities and rely upon these tribal governments to deliver services that they need.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate the point you're making about, the need to make sure that the federal government has a good process for consultation of tribal governments, because it seems to me that process would go a long way toward making sure that the money goes where it needs to be, right? And is used effectively. So, I think that's a really important point, and one that I'm sure Congresswoman Haaland will be interested in addressing in her remarks, and something I think for the oversight conversation, right, to bear in mind. So in spite of the challenges that you're identifying and the many challenges that you're identifying, we know that tribal governments are working hard, and they're not waiting for the feds, right? They're working hard to keep their communities safe and taking steps every day on behalf of their communities. And I think it would be really important for our listeners to have an opportunity to learn about some of the solutions that tribal governments are putting in place, if you would be so kind as to share that with us.
It's a great question. And just know Indian country is strong, all right? We've been through numerous periods in the history of the United States that have tried to taken us out, assimilation, termination, all the stuff that went on when first people came over here. And we still exist today. We're still strong. So we'll work our way through this, regardless, of the inadequacies that may come, not come our way because of certain actions that needed to happen. But what we're seeing tribes do is helping one another. Many tribes, like with the Navajo Nation that you mentioned, they're really getting hit very hard by that. And many tribes, like the Cherokee Nation, have lent them resources and equipment and things to help them deal with the enormous challenge that they have. We have many tribes that are converting some of their hotels and their business properties into shelters and places for those that may be sick, those that need to be quarantined, those that need to be protected, and also to address the overcrowded home situation. In Indian country, the overcrowded home situation is 8 times the national average. You have numerous generations living in one house because of the poor funding for housing over many decades. And in a situation like this, in a pandemic that really gains a lot of speed when you have a lot of people close together, it's a real serious situation in Indian country. So we see tribes being resourceful with the resources they have that have been closed down, viable businesses, and being able to use those in ways to keep their communities safe.
Well, thank you. And we're so grateful for the work that you're doing in the advocacy. I want to bring Congresswoman Haaland into this conversation. Congresswoman, we are just honored and grateful to have you. We know how busy you are right now, and it's every single minute. I imagine you're either on a Zoom call, talking to your constituents, trying to legislate federal policy. This is a time where our lawmakers who have real heart and real soul are just working around the clock. And I know you, and I know that's how you do. So we're really grateful to have you join us. Congresswoman Haaland is an incredible progressive champion from New Mexico's 1st District. She is a very special guest to have on our program. She's a member of the Laguna Pueblo Nation and one of the first 2 Native American women elected to the United States Congress. Representative Haaland has been working tirelessly to address the needs of her district and tribal nations in this crisis of unprecedented proportions. So first off, Congresswoman, thank you for being here. And we would love to just hear a little bit about how the folks in your district are doing and how you're doing right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. And first, I am so honored to be on a panel with some amazing people. Kevin, thank you for opening this conversation up for us. And your job is definitely not easy right now. But I'm grateful and honored to be with all of you, you know, strong advocates for Indian country, activists, folks on the front lines. And so thank you for the invitation, Liz. And to the Progressive Caucus Center for recognizing the importance of Native American issues during this terrible health crisis, and generally, of course. So look, as the numbers grow of deaths and confirmed cases, we're seeing Indian country take the brunt of this pandemic more than any other group, including areas within my district. Over the weekend, the Navajo Nation essentially surpassed New York and New Jersey for the highest per capita coronavirus infection rate in the United States. In my home state of New Mexico, Native Americans are about 11% of the population, and we're 58% of the statewide coronavirus cases. This administration continues to drag their feet to distribute the funding and the resources that tribes need from everywhere, from every federal agency. The smaller tribes and pueblos in New Mexico have struggled to receive needed resources from the CDC and FEMA, and there have been numerous hurdles that smaller tribes have had to deal with just to receive the PPE and tribal consultation from the CDC just to get access to basic resources and funding. The pueblos in my state still haven't received CDC funding that Congress specifically allocated to tribal governments in the last stimulus package. So we are, you know, we keep moving forward. We're doing everything we can to make sure that people have what they need for this emergency.
Well, thank you for your leadership, and what you are fighting for in Congress is so important. I know last week was a very busy week for you with the House passing the HEROES Act, which was a nearly $3 trillion coronavirus relief package. Can you tell us about what's in the HEROES Act, what, you know, and any other legislation that you want to address in terms of relief that you think has been especially important so far, and what you're fighting for next?
Sure, sure. So first, I'd just like to thank all the tribes and tribal leaders for their continued advocacy for their communities to make sure their members are getting the resources they need. The collective voices of all the tribes who have weighed in on this issue make a huge difference in moving legislation forward in DC, especially during this crisis. We always need to advocate, and it helps when all of us are on the same page pushing those things forward. So the HEROES Act includes some serious funding for tribes, tribal organizations, and organizations that support Indian country, including $20 billion for tribal governments. We had to address tribal business concerns on the PPP loans so that tribal businesses were able to access that funding. A $2.1 billion funding boost for the Indian Health Service and tribally operated healthcare facilities, and $64 million for urban Indian health organizations. Not everybody lives in their home communities. People live in cities across the country to live and go to school and work. So I'm sure that Mitch McConnell is not actually addressing this right now, but we're going to keep pushing it and hope that the Senate will pick it up and move it forward. We're going to need everyone to put the pressure on the Senate to make sure that the HEROES Act can go up for a vote. This isn't just for Indian country, it's for everybody. It includes hazard pay, emergency rental and utility payment assistance, help for the Postal Service, and funding for state and local governments. So we're working very hard. There's a lot in this act that will help every single community across our country. So, yes.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I'm sure when we get to the question and answer period, I think folks are eager to hear more from you about all the federal efforts. I know you've just been, as I said, around the clock on federal policy. I do want to ask one question before we move on, which is about your work on education issues at this time. So I know you have long been a champion for education and particularly concerned about access to education for Native American children. I would love to hear about how you are thinking about this issue during a time of pandemic and what we need to do to make sure that all children have access to education at this critical time.
Right. Well, it boils down to broadband internet service, right? Which rural communities across our country are lacking. Yes, and it's absolutely an Indian country. I was speaking with a woman from a Washington tribe just last week, and she referred to the tribe that she consults with as the darkest place in Washington state. The tribal government is still on dial-up because they don't have access to broadband internet service. This is a reality for so many people, and that affects our kids. Kids were sent home and the schools closed. A lot of kids, if you're lucky, and I consider myself lucky, I'm using broadband right now to converse with all of you. People are not that lucky. So we want to pass an emergency broadband bill to make sure that kids can get internet. We need to close the homework gap for kids right now. The Bureau of Indian Education recently stated that some of the BIE schools found that up to 90% of their students don't have access to broadband services. This is unheard of. It's almost as if, internet service is a human right in the year 2020. And imagine what, some of our areas who have been hit hard by COVID-19 could do if they were able to contact their medical professionals more readily. So we're working on making sure that tribes can access these spectrum licenses, these waves that go, and there's fiber laying all through tribal land. but tribes are unable to use it. I had a member of the Jemez Pueblo in my office, a couple months back, and said the fiber's 40 feet from our school, but they can't access it because they don't have the licenses to do that. So that's what we're trying to do, to essentially right this wrong. It's wrong not to allow tribes to access spectrum over their own tribal lands, especially when it prevents tribal members from calling 911, from getting medical help, from their kids being able to access the internet so they can do their homework. That's all important, and that's why we're working hard to make sure that we get this emergency package together. We have support for it across the country, and so we'll keep pushing on it.
Thank you. I hear your passion on the need to make sure that broadband access is universally available, and I often think of it like clean water, right? I mean, it's something that people need to exist today. But I think what you just said, we should think about broadband as a human right. I think you might have just started a new campaign. So that seems right on. And as somebody who spent more time than I would have liked to this morning on the internet, learning about rhombuses and parallelograms with my 9-year-old. She was distance learning in school. Distance learning is something that every single child should have access to. And we know that even when kids go back to school, that so much of their homework is done online. And if we are going to actually offer every child in this country equal access to education, that means equal access to broadband. So just right on for the work that you're doing. It's so important. Thank you. I want to turn now to Faith Spotted Eagle. Faith Spotted Eagle, we are just honored and thrilled to have you here with us this evening. And thank you so much for being with us tonight. Faith Spotted Eagle is a grandmother, a Dakota language teacher, and a lifelong organizer and advocate. She is a member of the Yankton Sioux Nation and a founding member of the Brave Heart Society, an organization for teaching girls about traditional culture. She is also a board member of the Native Organizers Alliance. She is a leading voice against the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines and has also served as the chair of the Ihangtuang Treaty Steering Committee. So Faith Spotted Eagle, thank you so much. We are honored to have you join us tonight. And I want to begin by asking you the same question I just asked Congresswoman Haaland. How are you doing right now?
I'm doing good. And thank you for that great introduction. It got me all fired up. And those 3 areas of my involvement are going to be reflected in my remarks. First of all, I'm an elder. I'm 71 years old. I'm a grandmother. And one of the charges that grandmothers should have is they should be good to listen to. So I'm going to try my best to be good to listen to. The other 2 areas on the treaty committee, the whole purpose of being on the treaty committee is to protect a way of life, the way we were pre-treaty, and we tried to preserve it. And I'll say something about that later. The Brave Heart Society is for the purpose of preserving our life way. The good medicine of our culture is what is going to help us survive. So having said that, I just want to say some real exciting positives that we're experiencing in this sacred time that we're living in, this challenging sacred time of this thing from nature that has presented itself in a strange way. And then I want to talk about some challenges. The first exciting thing is that, remember, our knowledge literally comes from a place. We are a place-based people. So our experience of the place that we grew up in is our strength, and we make relationship with that. So when this pandemic started to come, and we've had many, many pandemics, as Kevin said, and I'll talk about that later, we thought, what could we do during this space and time? And so some of the young people, my son, my grandson, some other people said, let's just really amp it up on our gardens. And so we've had garden projects. I grew up with a completely half-acre garden. We had aquaculture, but a lot of the younger people haven't done this. And I had a realization after we went out and did this. We tilled 105 gardens in our immediate area. 105 in a week and a half. And one of the things that I realized, we rented a tiller and a tractor, which cost $300 a day. We had it for 4 days, so that's $1,200. And I thought about it, when you talk about food sovereignty in tribal terms or just regular terms across the nation, there's an amount of privilege that exists because you have the ability to get a tiller. You have the ability to get the resources that are needed to have a garden. You have to buy the plants. You have to have a car to go get the plants. So once we did that, I was totally, what a lesson for an elder to think that some of these people would have done that, particularly the young people. They were so excited. In fact, some of us chased us down when we were pulling the tractor. They would be driving after us and they'd say, don't forget us, we want a garden. And the gardens were all sizes. The other thing, the realization that came to me is during the allotment era, when we had another pandemic and the government decided to allot our land to all the farmers because our land was so rich, I was so taken back at the richness of the soil. We have black, beautiful, powdery soil. It can grow anything. Even if you have a black thumb, there's hope for you. And so when we realized that, it was so exciting. Some of the people would come out. We went to this family along the river, and she came out and she brought me a basket of eggs. And she said, I can't pay you. And I said, you don't have to pay me. We're helping like neighbors. And she said, well, here's my chicken's eggs. And she gifted them to us. Another person came out with some beadwork, but they were all, and this was not a government program. This is grassroots. And that was the beauty of it. We just kept going for a week and a half. A couple of the young people who were helping, they had gotten in trouble, and their uncle dragged them to me and they said, you're gonna have to work for Kunshi because you haven't behaved. And I thought, okay, that's a good reason to go work hard. And so they were so excited though after we got done. They just kept going. And they said, we could keep going all summer. And I said, well, we got to plant the gardens now. But I think that has been a real lesson for me, is that you can tell people to be sovereign about food, but if they don't even have the location, because some of the housing areas have regulations where you can't dig a garden. I went to one house and she said, I didn't get permission. And I said, okay, we'll ask later. If we are not supposed to put it there, we'll find out. And so we went ahead and tilled the garden, asked questions later, and it turned out it was okay. So now we've got these young, I had a gardener who was a gardener maybe 10 years ago. And when she first started, I went to check on her and she was watering all the weeds and the plants all together. And I said, oh, you didn't weed, huh? And she said, I can't tell the difference between the weeds and the plants, so I water everything. And I told her, I said, you just hit on something that was a gardening technique, and they write about it in the Mother Jones magazine, that when we had gardens along the Missouri River, we couldn't tend them all the time because we had to hunt, we had to take care of our families. So they grew up with the weeds, and the weeds protected them. And so she hit on an old gardening technique, and she was so excited, even though she didn't know the difference between the plants. And I thought that kind of knowledge comes from a place-based society. And so we're pretty excited about that. When we started tilling the gardens, 2 young women came out of the woodwork or the gardens. One of them was from the Girls and Boys Club, and she had taken a master gardener class, and she said, I can mentor them. I can map out the gardens with them. Because some of them were scared. They had never had a garden before, and they said, now everybody knows I have a garden. What if it doesn't grow? And so I just tell them, well, it's next year. We'll try again next year. Another lady came out with seeds from the Indian Child Welfare Program, and she said, we will provide the seeds for the families. I got a call from an ethnobotanist from North Dakota, from the Standing Rock Reservation. She showed up with food packets and seeds. People have been sending us seeds from all across the country because they saw these young people doing these gardens. And so that's the challenging part. The next move that we're going to make is we're going to buy bundles of fishing equipment for some of the young people so they can harvest the treaty right that we have on the Missouri River. And they're going to relearn how important the fish, with all the mega fats that you get from the vitamins in the pharmacy, you don't have to go buy those vitamins. You can get it out of the river. And so if it's not too polluted, of course, that's another issue, but we're going to exert our treaty right with our fishing. The third thing we're going to do is we got a grant from a precious individual who gave us some funds, and we're going to teach the girls who are experiencing some domestic violence. And during this period of time, of course, they're impacted. because they are isolated. So we're going to teach them kayaking, and they're going to make relationship with the river. And so the river, as we know, Maniwi Choni is life. And so we've got a whole social distancing plan for the summer. And so we have that going, and it's pretty exciting because that is the purpose of our society, is to preserve, restore, and enhance the culture. The second issue of treaty rights, I think that if you look at what we're dealing with, we're looking at geographics. We happen to be along the river. We're on the northern plains. There's certain climate things that are going on. We had a flood because of climate change last summer when they had this phenomena called cyclone that came, cold weather and hot weather at the same time, all of a sudden. So our community was flooded, and we have lost at least 15 houses to this flood. Regardless of that, talk about the resiliency of our people. You have a person who's in a flooded house with a flooded basement, and they're concerned about getting a garden. How resilient is that? And so I think that our people can surmount many of those things, but of course we need resources that hopefully will not be held up by these hierarchies that are put in place to give somebody power over somebody else. And that's why we have people like the two individuals that talked before me. The other thing that I want to say is that I think the philosophy of our traditional societies that I belong to, that this has been going on a long time. You know, this isn't our first rodeo, this pandemic. We had the smallpoxes when they brought the blankets to kill us. We had the land takings. We had the outlawing of our language, and the list is very, very long. But the point is that it has not ended beyond the virus. Just recently, when I look at geographics, the other area I want to talk, that I just talked about historical, and the biological reality of what's going on is that we are an at-risk population, because when my grandfather signed away 200 million acres in eastern South Dakota, he had prepaid health care, health, education, and welfare. That's why he was generous enough to share our land with immigrants who had nowhere to go and had been oppressed. And so they've forgotten that, because at this minute that we're talking, the governor of South Dakota is saying that we do not have the right to protect our people with roadblocks. We are being more safe on the reservations because we understand vulnerability. In any society or population, the marginalized people are going to suffer more. Everything is going to be magnified if you're a marginalized population. And so that's why we've shut our borders. That's why we have people out there patrolling at the checkpoints, because what's happening along the Missouri River, the tourists are pouring into South Dakota. They're pouring into the Black Hills. They're pouring in. There are more people at our docks along the river than from South Dakota. They're coming from Minnesota. They're coming from Nebraska. They're coming from Colorado by droves. And so what choice do we have but to shut the borders? Because we are already vulnerable. Our treaty to right has not been honored with Indian Health Service. And we really never have been funded for preventative care. And I think the other natives on the panel know this well, that in order to get adequate services, it's life or limb. You have to be dying, or you have to break a limb in order to get quality health care up front. Otherwise, you're at the end of the line. But despite that, I'm feeling pretty excited about the food sovereignty movement that this food revolution that we're having with these young people particularly. And I'm so excited when we hit the river, because the river is gonna be our teacher this summer. And so a lot of people across the nation have responded, and they understand that they have to figure out if they're going to be a place-based nation in the United States, they have to recognize that they have a responsibility to protect that land. At this moment, there's a pipeline that's being built where there's going to be thousands of men that are coming into our territory. It's a biological reality that makes us even more vulnerable. We're worried about that. And so we're going to have to protect in any way that we can. And so I believe in ourselves. We're resilient, we're creative, and we've been here for thousands of years. And our DNA is going to direct us. And I think the sad part is, of course, all the relatives that we have lost to this pandemic. The positive side is I have never been at home so much in a very long time, and I'm getting a lot done. And work, health, children, grandchildren, and I think that I'm valuing that because it's a wake-up call from Mother Earth. Mother Earth is speaking, and all of us need to listen. I'll stop there if you have any questions.
I want to say that what you just shared about the place-based work that you're doing and working with young people on gardening and now starting the kayaking program, I think really that's just something that everyone can learn from, because I do think in this moment where people are at home and we sort of live in this society where, you know, in some ways we can all kind of become avatars, right? And we're just on the internet all the time, and you know, so disconnected from where we are in the earth underneath our feet. I think it is really an important time to forge that reconnection, and I think it is very healing, and it's something actually I've been doing with my kids around gardening.
Yeah,
now
I think an important distinction to make is that it's not a project or it's not a program. A program and a project is a Western way of framing something, so you create a hierarchy that somebody is in charge. Mm-hmm. The type of things that we're doing are a life way. They're in a circle. And so dad can teach son, dad can teach daughter, mom can teach, grandma can teach. They might try to keep me out of those kayaks, but I'm going to be there on the shore. And so it's a circle of life where we're really going back to the good old way of doing things. But if people would recognize this is old, new teachings, and that when we put roadblocks up, that is what we are preserving. We are preserving our very way of life, and we have the right to do that. Mm-hmm. We signed those treaties that were unilateral documents from nation to nation, and we still stand by that. So that's my soapbox for the day.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Very well taken. Thank you for sharing that. And I bet you're going to be in one of those kayaks I just predicted.
Yeah, I do have one final comment. I want to remind all the people of Turtle Island, what you call the United States, that are watching tonight, when we signed those treaties, the people that are citizens of the United States also signed those treaties. So treaties are not just about Native people. They are just as responsible for enforcing that treaty if they are a citizen of the United States. So I appeal to their conscience, their sense of duty, and the fact that we have a better way of living if we really take it seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I want to bring in Representative Ruth Buffalo to the conversation. And Representative Buffalo represents North Dakota's 27th district, and we're so honored to have you join us this evening. Thank you so much for making time in what I know is just an incredibly hectic and difficult time. Representative Buffalo is an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, and was elected in 2018 as the first Native American Democratic woman elected to the North Dakota State Legislature. Thank you so much for joining us, Representative Buffalo. And again, I want to start by asking how you and your community are doing during this very difficult time.
Thank you, Madzigadadz. Thank you for having me. Well, as you might know, North Dakota's curve hasn't reached its peak yet. To date, we have lost 49 lives within North Dakota, and more specifically within Cass County, the county in which my family and I currently reside in, which has the highest number of cases, 1,277. People are very concerned with making ends meet right now. They're very fearful to go to work and in fear of contracting the virus. For some, health insurance is still a very extreme worry. For others, their loved ones in long-term care settings is a very real concern. Anxiety about the virus is very common, and the state of North Dakota is going to have to concern itself with the mental health of its citizens as well as all ages. Our tribal nations within North Dakota are doing the best they can with what resources they have. COVID-19 task forces have been formed to prevent the spread of COVID-19 within those communities, and mass testing events are being held. Although testing still needs to be more widespread due to the risks posed if the virus were to spread to those tribal communities who lack a lot of the healthcare infrastructure that we need and deserve. We look forward to when there is an antibodies test to get a better assessment of whether immunity exists within our communities.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I know that in addition to your work as a state representative and as an advocate for the community, you are also a known political healer, and you define that as someone who works to bring cultural trauma into public memory and create spaces for healing. Native American nations have a painful history with pandemics in this country. And I was hoping that you could talk about the impact that this modern pandemic is having on Native Americans in particular, and how we can create spaces for healing in the midst of this pandemic.
Yes, I also want to just kind of make mention of how the political healers movement came to be. A group of young women out of Minnesota hosted a one-day convening for women of color, and it was also underneath the umbrella of Take Action Minnesota, in partnership with People's Action at the national level. And so really what political healing is about is being in spaces that we weren't welcome in historically. And so I'm very honored to be a part of the political healers group, and we know that now more than ever it's needed. And I also want to honor my ancestors, the Mandan tribe, who was almost completely wiped out from smallpox. Years ago, we were known as the ambassadors of the plains, and that was almost to our detriment. But as the previous speakers have shared, we are very resilient. And in today's day and age, we are seeing so many beautiful things come to light. People are showcasing their talent through social media, through the social distancing powwow, the powwow dancing, quarantine specials. Even our native humor is being showcased through social media. I believe there's a comedy show that is going to be raising funds for the NCAI's COVID Relief Fund this Friday, and I have been a fan of this group throughout the quarantine, so to speak. They have been hosting Indian comedy hours through through Instagram and also through different various media outlets. And so again, just want to say that we're adapting, we're adjusting to these COVID-19 times. And so that's a beautiful thing, because this has really caused a lot of us to slow down and reflect. But I want to switch gears and talk about some of the serious issues that this pandemic is exposing to others who might not have been aware of the structural inequities that many of us have been facing for decades. So the pandemic has laid bare the weak spots in a hierarchical infrastructure that we're supposed to trust. We're seeing across the country that Indigenous, Black and Brown lives are disproportionately dying because of the lack of adequate funding to the essential services needed in these communities. Healthcare, food distribution, access to employment. You know, how do we establish care systems that value all people? Our incarcerated relatives are fighting this virus at higher rates. Of the top 50 clusters of the coronavirus cases, 33 are in prisons and jails. The tragic and preventable death of the late Miss Andrea Circlebear has really brought attention again to an existing issue of the disproportionate overrepresentation of Native Americans in the criminal justice system in every level of government, including our juvenile justice system. And so we need to help send our relatives home from jails and prisons, those that are most vulnerable to COVID-19, including those who are pregnant and elderly, So we need more calls for the passage of the Emergency Community Supervision Act. This act would require the Federal Bureau of Prisons to release those who are pregnant, those with underlying health conditions, and those who are 50 years old and older. Had this bill been enacted, it could have prevented the death of Andrea Circlebear, and it could have prevented the death of several dozen others who fell into these categories. American Indian people, whether they are in rural or urban communities, statistically are poor and experience higher rates of key risk factors when compared to the nation as a whole. This, combined with diminished social safety nets, strained healthcare systems, and vulnerable infrastructure, means that Indigenous communities will feel the shock of this pandemic. Infrastructure like roads, drinking water facilities, and energy resources are in need of major updates. Many communities, as mentioned earlier, also suffer from a severe lack of internet connectivity, putting them at a great disadvantage in our crisis that requires working from home when possible. We have the opportunity to create jobs and level the playing field for these communities, healing those gaps with meaningful policy. This crisis is an opportunity to get ahead of the source of nearly all coming crises for future generations of our American Indian communities and all Americans. Climate-related flood, drought, heat wave, and crop failures, while extractive industries foul environmental resources with dire human consequences. But the solutions to environmental problems can create economic regeneration and community multipliers that solve social and economic problems concurrently. Matzigirads, and thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us here tonight and for laying out so clearly an agenda for action. I want to bring in Tara Houska to the conversation. And Tara is our last panelist tonight, and then we'll save some time for your questions. So last but certainly not least, Tara Houska is an enrolled member of the Couchiching First Nation. And Tara, just please correct me if I butcher any pronunciations. I apologize if I do. Born and raised across the lake in International Falls, Minnesota. She's a tribal attorney, founder of the Giniw Collective. The Giniw Collective is a grassroots frontline effort led by Indigenous women to protect the sacred and empower the next generation of leadership with traditional values. Tara is a former Native advisor to the Bernie Sanders campaign and a co-founder of Not Your Mascots, a nonprofit that educates the public about the harms of stereotyping and promotes positive representation of Native Americans. She lives on the front lines of the resistance against Enbridge's Line 3 tar sands pipeline. So Tara, I want to start off by asking you how you're doing during this pandemic and how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting your fight for environmental justice and your advocacy work.
Buju Giniw, it's really great to hear all of your voices and to see all of your faces and hear all of those comments. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of such a diverse caucus of people that have been brought together here today, and I really appreciate hearing all these different issues, kind of rapid fire, you know, of everything that's happening in Indian country, or at least as many issues as we can squeeze in this short period of time. I'm part of the Giniw Collective. I'm Anishinaabe from Couchiching First Nation. I would bring in the perspective of, you know, I live in a resistance camp fighting Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. It's a tar sands line out of Alberta and the expansion of the tar sands industry. You know, I think the pandemic has been an interesting situation in the sense of, for us, we're already isolated. We live on the land and we're out there, you know, fighting off, right now we're fighting off ticks, but we're we're out there also engaging in sustainable foods and trying to, you know, engage in sustainable harvesting of foods and teaching our youth and elevating the community members and teaching these old ways and learning them too. You know, I really appreciated when Faith was talking about these are life ways, right? Like this is an actual life way. It's not something that you commodify into a program. You know, I would also add that I think, you know, hearing the words, you know, water is life, right? Water is everything. And I think this pandemic has shown that, you know, we're seeing all these articles kind of now coming out, right, of 17% reduction in carbon emissions since January, from that January to April timeframe. You know, this so-called impossible reality of moving away from intensive fossil fuel industry is actually quite possible. You know, our future is in front of us, and we as human beings have a choice to make about that. We have to decide for ourselves whether water really is life, or whether we think the industries of money and extreme capitalism into oligarchy and corporate control are really going to be our reality. You know, what I've seen on this pandemic has been the beauty of mutual aid and all these community members that are coming together as we've been waiting for these funds to actually flow into our hospitals and flow into the infrastructure in Indian country. The outpouring of support for each other, of people that are grassroots, that are out there purchasing supplies all over the country, bringing it to where it's needed, of tribal nations helping other tribal nations. You know, I've seen some really, really beautiful things happening in this time, although it's been very, very hard on our communities, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. You know, we're seeing poverty and we're seeing racism and structural racism play out in very real ways to people all over Turtle Island and around the world. You know, I think for us on front lines, the reality has been past just the observation of how possible our potential reality could be, has also been the uptick in these fossil fuel industries and other extractive economies into using the pandemic as a cover to get through what they want. So here in our territory, we're fighting Line 3. And next door to us in Faith and Ruth's territory, they're fighting the Keystone XL pipeline. You move over to British Columbia, in that territory, they're fighting the Trans Mountain pipeline. Those are all tar sands lines coming out of the same source. Right next to that, they're fighting the Coastal GasLink pipeline with Wet'suwet'en people. You know, as the pandemic has really gone up, so has the amount that these companies have been able to do in the territory. They have been working as fast as possible. They have been installing man camps all over all these different routes that I just mentioned. You know, here in our territory, we're looking at the influx of 4,000 to 6,000 workers into the state of Minnesota to build Line 3. You know, we're controlled by a Democrat. So whether it's Democrat or Republican, you know, we have to make other decisions as human beings and to have our rights heard and to recognize that without water, we do not have life.
Thank you, Tara. And I know in addition to your work on environmental justice issues, or I'm sure overlapping, one of the other issues that you really think a lot about and have done a lot of advocacy around is corporate accountability. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, you know, as we see the federal government, right, these relief packages are big at the scale of trillions of dollars. And how do we make sure that the relief that goes out doesn't lead to further corporate concentration of power, that we are actually making sure that these funds are spent in ways that builds our communities instead of diminishes them?
Yeah, it's been pretty amazing, but maybe not so amazing and not so surprising to see how quickly money materialized for these relief packages when we've heard that so many of these ongoing issues of structural racism and of people left out of the conversation are just simply impossible to address. But here was just trillions of dollars that just magically appeared so quickly. But within that, you know, the really I think, frankly, shameful part of some of these packages has been to see the heavy influence of corporate bailouts, of money that's actually intended for people, right? Like many of us have received these $1,200 checks, right? And that's what we got out of the federal government. but it was supposed to be a whole lot more, right? It was supposed to be investments into small businesses, into large businesses, into community businesses, into community hospitals, into the people that are serving underserved neighborhoods and communities. That's what was supposed to happen, right? We all thought maybe this was supposed to be for healthcare and for personal protective equipment for our doctors and nurses and our frontline people. But instead, there's been these massive carve-outs for corporate bailout, and for specifically for the financial institutions as well. The financial institutions that have, in the way that I look at them and the way that I fight against them, is their deep investment into continuing the extractive economy, into forcing through the fossil fuel industry, regardless of the fact that we know climate crisis is happening, regardless of the fact that they know that we have alternate solutions of, alternative forms of energy that are completely available and have been for decades, yet they continue to fund the fossil fuel industry. And so there's a few different bills that I've seen that have kind of been floating through. One of them that, I have hope for is the Rewind Act. It's sponsored by Senator Merkley. It basically limits any sort of bailout money for fossil fuel industry. I think that, in terms of corporate accountability, there are places around the globe that do a lot better job than the United States. I think the United States could certainly do a lot more when it comes to making sure that the financiers behind so many of these decisions and so many of these corporate industries that are directly influencing elections, that are directly influencing what bills get sent out into the floor, what bills become law. There's a lot more that we could demand, and we should demand as citizens and as people who deserve a fair shot and fair representation of, hey, if you're getting these massive bailouts from, our money, our taxpayer dollars and money that's intended for us, how does it have absolutely no strings attached, absolutely no oversight? How is it that you as a banking institution are allowed to claim that you're somehow a, climate sustainable business when in fact you're actually financing and increasing the expansion of fossil fuels around the globe? Chase Bank is the single largest funder of fossil fuels in the world. The fact that we're at 30% expansion of the industry, of the expansion of the industry over just the last few years, that's just one bank, no oversight, and yet they're going to get a bailout.
Let's Congresswoman Haaland, because I know she does have to jump in right at 8 o'clock, and the rest of us can stay on a little bit longer, I hope, if you're able. But Congresswoman Haaland, I wanted to just bring you back into the conversation with a couple of questions about oversight and this what Tara is raising now, the need for really strong oversight of the funds that are going out, and then I think this really important question that was asked around or issue that was raised around how do we make sure that there's appropriate consultation, right, of tribal governments and of communities in the legislation that's being put together.
Right. So I was on a Zoom earlier with Wild Earth Guardians about Chaco Canyon and the plan, the BLM plan that essentially leaves the tribal voice out of the whole picture. They said you can participate by if you have internet, you can participate. And guess what? Not every, the people whose lives are being affected by all this pollution, methane being spewed into the air every time you turn around, they don't have internet. They can't participate. The president of the Navajo Nation is working on keeping his people alive. He can't stop what he's doing to weigh in on this issue. They find the most inopportune times to push all of this gas and oil forward, this administration. And, even I got sworn in during a government shutdown. Everything was closed except for the office that's approving these leases. So we see where this is an issue. Speaker Pelosi put together a committee to oversee the spending of these funds. Nothing surprises me about how the administration tries to make sure that everybody is taken care of that he wants to be taken care of. And, you know, our essential workers and our tribes and all the communities of color who are suffering the most don't have what they need. We are fighting every single day. And I wish things were different. There are a large number of my colleagues in Congress who care deeply about this issue, who are fighting against it, who are protecting our environment at every turn. We will absolutely keep doing that. I really wish things were different and that we valued our earth as much as we valued oil and gas and money, because people don't stop to realize everything that we've been saying here. Everything we have comes from the earth. It doesn't make sense that we just trash it every chance we get. So, Tara, I'm so honored and just so grateful for your voice. Thank you for everything every day that you say. And I promise you, I will try my best to keep fighting for those things because I know they're important.
Congresswoman Haaland, we know you have to probably go to your next Zoom call, I'm guessing. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you for your leadership in Congress. And we're so honored to have you. And
so much. You all take care.
So we're going to continue because we have a couple of other questions that I'd like to get to if our panelists can hang tight with us for just a few more minutes. And this question comes from Jinx in Massachusetts, who says, please, can you talk about the situation for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe that they're facing right now? So I could nominate someone to answer, or Kevin, I don't know if you want to take that one, or if there's someone else who would like to take it.
Yeah, I'll jump in for a little bit and leave some time for anybody else. So this is a very sad issue, and following up on what Representative Haaland spoke about, the timing of all this is all suspect, right? It was a Friday night in the middle of a pandemic that the Mashpee tribe received a phone call from the BIA director advising them that their land was going to be removed from trust. It's just mind-boggling, right? While tribes are dealing with this, severe problem, this threat that is significant for Indian country, given the health disparities, overcrowded home situation, and difficult access to health care, to do this is mind-boggling. As Faith mentioned earlier, we're a place-based people, all right? It is the heart of who we are. Our tribal governance, the exercise of our sovereignty, all depends on our tribal homelands. And in 1934, when the Indian Reorganization Act was enacted, that was to stop allotment. That was to respect tribal sovereignty and the governance aspect of tribal governments, and to restore lost land, homelands. We lost 90 million plus acres during the allotment period. And this was to return this opportunity back to tribes, give them a place, allow them to self-govern and grow their communities like they were supposed to be allowed to do based on the treaty trust obligation of the United States. And since, a decision, that's now, 1213, the Carcieri decision, there's been some question about what to do with it, but the previous administration put in a process in place that addressed it, that tribes post-1934 could work fairly through a process and have land in the trust. And so the Mashpee Wampanoag are one of those tribes. And in 2015, they went through that process. Prior to 2015, had land put into trust, and which is an amazing thing to happen, really important for the tribe, really important for the community, really important for its governance and exercise of its tribal sovereignty. And this administrative action, which untimely, actually receiving a lot of criticism from a federal court judge in Washington, D.C., some of the actions around this and the pulling of opinions that exist over at the Bureau of Indian Affairs on putting land into trust, it is really difficult to swallow right now for all of us. And NCAI, along with all our tribal organizational partners, are in this 100% to support the Mashpee Wampanoag. This is unnecessary, it's unconscionable, and certainly something that we will not let go. We will not let this pandemic hide this unacceptable action. And for this to happen at this particular time really gives us a clear picture of what this administration thinks of Indian country right now. This is really tragic, and we're gonna be all over this. And my heart and NCAI's board and membership, all hearts go out to the Mashpee Wampanoag. We're gonna do whatever we can to support their fight in getting this right.
Thank you so much for your advocacy. You just touched on another issue that one of our listeners wants to ask the panel to address, which is the question of making sure that tribal sovereignty is honored and respected in the relief efforts that are happening. So how do we make sure that any government aid that comes out does not have strings attached which are designed to threaten or undermine tribal sovereignty? And how do we look for those and fight back against them? And so I want to give other folks on the panel a chance to respond and see who, if anybody is interested in taking that, or Kevin, I bet you might have some thoughts on that one too. But is there anyone else who wants to respond to that question about how we make sure that tribal sovereignty is honored and respected in the relief packages that are being put forward?
I'd like to add something to that. I think that throughout our history, as Kevin has talked about, every now and then we have to take a big risk, and that is frightening in itself, but we end up having to preserve our political integrity because, like Tara said, it is a system, an oligarchy of institutional racism. Mm-hmm. So every time we make a little bit of progress, somebody has to stand up and say, you know, sit back down. And that is exactly what's happening in the state of South Dakota, because the governor has now requested help from the president to stop us from protecting our land. It's no different than what happened in the 1800s. The thing that's different now is she's relying on media. And so we have to amp our media. And I think people are starting to realize that this model of inhumanity that has been inflicted on us, it's happening all across America. We live in one of the most violent countries in the world. We're in denial about that, but it's happening. It begins in kindergarten. It progresses to middle school. And by the time you get out of high school, you have been completely oppressed to just conform. And that is so sad because we're losing so many bright, beautiful, creative minds that have been programmed to be oppressors. And so that is that model of inhumanity. So our people are taking a risk by standing up. And I do believe this time around, though, it's going to be different because we have people like our governor that really don't make sense. And I think reason is going to prevail because why? We are doing a better job. We're doing a better job of protecting our people, and we know how to protect our people. And that's what I'd like to add.
Is there anyone else who address that question? If not, I
could jump in. I could jump in real quick to add on that tribal consultation and respecting it and being genuine listeners when it comes to that. You know, not just checking a box that we did that. Tribal consultation's there for a reason, to listen to what tribal leaders have to say about a program that Congress has passed, okay? And about funds that have gone, you know, are earmarked for Indian country. how best to distribute those funds or manage those programs or put out those programs. And they need to do a much better job at that. You know, we just heard, you know, just in the last situation with the CARES Act and the tribal government relief funds, the CRF funds, how they pushed that money out, how they decided and using what data set they used to distribute the money, that wasn't even in the conversation. You know, and they didn't even mention to us that that would be a thought so tribal leaders could weigh in on it. So really respecting the knowledge and interests of tribal leaders in how the decision-making process on the disbursement of these funds is important. Congress did its job. The administration needs to do its job and make sure that money gets out the way it was intended to be.
Thank you so much for raising that. And I think that's a point that has been made loud and clear by all of our panelists on this call, and definitely absolutely needs to be what federal policymakers need to be doing right now, particularly as we see funds that haven't even yet to be spent, and the point about every day that goes by are more deaths and wreaking more havoc on communities. So I want to ask a question now, and this is our last question of the night, and I'd love to take a couple of different answers on this one. We're asking this question because we had approximately, one of my producers on the show said, I think we had, you know, hundreds of folks ask for us to ask this question or ask some version of it. So here is the question for all of you out there watching this program who wrote in and said, please ask this question. What can non-Indigenous folks do to support and appropriately respect Native communities during the pandemic?
Well, I hope it's not just during the pandemic first. I mean, there's that, right?
Very.
I hope it's generally, right? But I'll let somebody else answer before I do.
You know, it's neat. Go ahead. Go ahead, Faith. Yeah.
I'll just make it brief. I think we're in a very important time of voting. My hands up to Deb and Ruth for getting elected. I ran in my district last year and I learned so much. I had an awesome team of young people and we registered 1,400 Native people. And so I think the vote needs to get out there because, and if this, you know, our talking here touched your hearts, your heart is going to go a long way. Your spirit's going to make it move because things have to change. It's not only for you, it's for your grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren. And that's how far that vote can go. Very, very important time in our history. Thank you.
Does anyone?
I would say the easy answer is send money, but that's not the biggest, you know, the biggest thing that anybody can do. The biggest thing anybody can do is take the time, you know, Faith had hit on this earlier about the trust and treaty responsibilities and obligation by all parties, right? It's by the tribe, the nation, the citizens of the tribe, the citizens of the United States to understand what that is. People need to know who we are, what we are, why we are, and you know, all of that. There needs to be an education process so that you can support your legislators that may be in New Jersey, that may be in Pennsylvania. You know, you can support your legislators in when they're trying to advance American Indian, Alaska Native concerns, even though there aren't any reservations or those communities in those states. And understanding what the treaty and trust responsibility is. I talk to a lot of non-Native folks, ask them what a trust and treaty responsibility is, and they start twiddling their thumbs and looking up in the sky, right? Take the time to learn what that is. If you do, you'll get to understand the challenges and issues we have and the challenges and issues that our legislators face, you know, in the halls of Congress in trying to honor that treaty and trust responsibility.
Thank you, Kevin. Is there anyone who wants to answer this question? I'll take one last
I'll go. This is Ruth. Just want to echo the previous speakers, and also thank you for allowing us to share this space tonight together. But really, again, just, we hear a lot of talk about taking personal responsibility, to protect ourselves from COVID-19, but I would also like to add that to educating yourself, take that personal responsibility to understand what lands you reside on, which tribal nations used to live on the lands that you currently live on, and really try to be a good ally, try to help rather than contribute to the divide and conquer tactics that are so prevalent within this current administration.
Thank you. That was so well said. I do feel as though we could have probably, 1 hour for this conversation was just not nearly enough. And I appreciate that all of you held on with me for a little bit over 8 o'clock so that we could continue the dialogue. We are really lucky tonight to be joined by just this absolutely star-studded panel of amazing, amazing organizers and thinkers and activists. And I want to thank all of you for your advocacy. I want to thank you for the education that you provided to the folks who joined us here on this call tonight. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing in your communities and around the country in this really critical time, but the work that you do all the time, right? And we have a lot more to learn, and I'd like to figure out how we can host another one of these conversations and continue the learning, because if that was something that folks were open to, because this was, I think, just a phenomenal event. And what we know is that the systemic racism and systemic discrimination that has pervaded our nation since its founding has found a home in the time of pandemic. And that systemic racism and systemic discrimination are also present in the policymaking decisions that are getting made in Washington, and we need to root them out wherever we find them. And the work that you're doing to do that is incredibly important. The need for allies and the need for all of us to be in that work together is incredibly important. And so thank you for the light that you've shown on COVID-19 and its impact on tribal communities tonight. And thank you for the work that you're going to continue to do long into the future. So thanks also to the wonderful folks who joined us on the phone for this call and who sent in their questions and reflections and observations. We are all in this work together. I'm so grateful for all of you, for your passion and for the inspiration that you provided here tonight. So thank you all for joining us, and please all be well, and we look forward to being with you again. Thank you.